Hey everyone, welcome to Safety Stories. I'm your host, Dr. Sharita Green. In these episodes, we will dig into real stories related to workplace safety experienced throughout history, gain understanding of the history, politics, key players, as well as some of the outcomes, while diving into lived stories that impacted everyday people. Our hope is to present historical information in an unbiased way that leaves you inspired to dig deeper and learn more about our shared history. Welcome to our first episode, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, Chemical Warfare and Workplace Chemicals. So grab your headphones, settle in, and let's get into it. Today's safety story involves the United States military as the employer. It involves over 9 million impacted employees. The exposure dates are from January 9th, 1962 to May 7th, 1975. And the exposure locations are select U.S. military bases as well as various locations of Southeast Asia. And what we'll be focusing on are hazardous chemical exposures. Some of the contributing factors that we're going to discuss will be ignoring scientific evidence, lack of regulations regarding exposure, lack of protective measures, methods of application, contamination with dioxin, widespread use as well as volume, lack of early scientific understanding, as well as environmental persistence. What we will be comparing this to is where we currently sit with OSHA. OSHA currently requires that employers provide conditions and practices that ensure a safe work environment and that work environment is free of recognized hazards. Also, we will compare it to our current OSHA's HAZCOM standard, often known as HAZCOM or the Hazard Communication Standard. It's designed to ensure that employees are aware of chemical hazards that are present in the workplace and that the information is accessible to all employees. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today we're diving into one of the most haunting legacies of the Vietnam War, something that left scars, not just on the land, but on generations of people, the rainbow herbicides. Between 1962 and 1971, the U.S. military launched a campaign. It was called Operation Ranch Hand. The goal was to strip away the dense jungle that gave cover to enemy forces, but instead of using bulldozers, they used chemicals, millions of gallons of them. These herbicides were color coded based on the stripes on the barrel, and together they became known as the rainbow herbicides. Let's break them down really quickly. Agent Orange, it was the most infamous. It was a mix of two herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. It was contaminated with dioxin, a highly toxic compound that's linked to cancer, birth defects, as well as other serious health issues. Agent Blue targeted rice crops and contained arsenic compounds. Agent White, Pink, Green, and Purple were used in varying combinations and concentrations, each with its own toxic profile. Over 20 million gallons of these chemicals were sprayed across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The environmental damage was catastrophic. Forests turned into wastelands, crops were destroyed, ecosystems were shattered, but the human toll was by far even worse. An estimated 4.8 million Vietnamese people were exposed. Many suffered from cancers, reproductive issues, birth defects that still persist to this day. U.S. veterans, they were not spared either. Thousands reported long term health problems, leading to lawsuits and decades of advocacy for recognition and care. Today, the legacy of rainbow herbicides is still continuing to unfold. We have contaminated soil and water that remain in parts of Vietnam, and the children and grandchildren of those exposed continue to face health challenges. This isn't just history, it's a reminder of how the tools of war, as well as the workplace, can echo throughout generations. Let's take the time to understand how chemical war unfolded. Who were the key players and what were some of the outcomes? It all started in Midland, Michigan, home to the Dow Chemical Company, one of the primary manufacturers of Agent Orange and other herbicides used during the Vietnam War. These chemicals, color coded as Agent Orange, blue, white, pink, green, and purple, were developed for tactical use, designed to defoliate jungles and destroy crops. From Dow's facilities, the chemicals were transported under military contracts to various U.S. military depots, including Gulfport, Mississippi, and Johnston Atoll, where they were stored and repackaged for deployment. Once in the hands of the U.S. military, the herbicides were loaded onto C-123 aircraft and shipped to Southeast Asia. The primary destination was, of course, Vietnam, where they were doing Operation Ranch Hand. That began in 1962, but the spraying didn't stop at Vietnam's borders. Laos and Cambodia, nations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, were also heavily targeted in secret bombings and defoliation campaigns. These operations aimed to disrupt enemy supply lines but devastated local ecosystems and communities. Meanwhile, Thailand served as a strategic staging ground or staging point for U.S. air bases like U Tapao and Nakhon Phanom were used to launch missions, and herbicides were stored and possibly tested there. Further east, in Okinawa, Japan, this became a very controversial waypoint. Though the U.S. government has denied having large-scale storage there, veterans and researchers have documented evidence of Agent Orange stockpiles and contamination at sites like Kadena Air Force Base as well as Machinado Service Area. Even South Korea was not untouched or unbothered. Along the Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ, herbicides were used to clear vegetation for surveillance as well as defense. Veterans stationed there between 1968 and 1971 have also reported exposure and health issues. As for North Korea, there's no confirmed use of rainbow herbicides there or within its borders. However, the proximity of U.S. operations in the South as well as geopolitical tensions of the era make it part of the broader Cold War context. We understand the seriousness of the chemical exposures, but let's understand some of the key players as well as the state of our country leading up to and during that time of the Vietnam War. When Truman took office in 1945, the world was shifting rapidly. World War II had just ended and a new ideological battle, the Cold War, was just beginning. President Truman's administration was one of the first to adopt a hardline stance against the spread of communism, a policy that would become known as containment. The idea was simple but powerful. If one country fell to communism, others might follow, a concept that was later dubbed the domino effect. To prevent that, Truman pledged U.S. support, military and economic and political, to countries that resisted communist influence. Entering into this conversation was the French Indochina, which included Vietnam. After World War II, France tried to reassert control over the region, but what they faced fierce resistance from the Viet Minh, a nationalist and communist-led movement under the Ho Chi Minh group. Despite warnings from the U.S. diplomats that backing France could lead to a prolonged conflict, President Truman chose to support the French. In 1950, he approved a $23 million bill for military aid to help France fight the Viet Minh. He also sent a military assistant advisory group, or known as the MAAG, to Vietnam, not as a combat troop, but to oversee the use of U.S. equipment. This marked a pivotal turning point. The U.S. was no longer neutral in Vietnam. Truman's decision was driven by Cold War logic. He feared that a communist victory in Vietnam would embolden the Soviet Union and China, and they would be a threat to U.S. interests in Asia. While Truman never sent American troops into battle in Vietnam, his policies they laid the foundation for deeper involvement by future presidents. His commitment to containment, his support for the French, and his framing of Vietnam as a Cold War battleground would echo throughout the decades. The Vietnam War was the longest U.S. conflict before Afghanistan, and there were four presidents who carried its burden. The Vietnam War stretched from 1955 to 1975, lasting nearly 20 years. It was a Cold War era conflict that tested American leadership, divided the nation, and left a lasting legacy. Let's meet the four presidents who oversaw the war. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, from 1953 to 1961. Eisenhower didn't send combat troops, but he laid the groundwork. In 1955, he committed U.S. support to South Vietnam and sent military advisors to help train their forces. He also warned of the domino effect, the idea that if the Vietnam fell to communism, others in Southeast Asia would follow. President John F. Kennedy, from 1961 to 1963, Kennedy increased U.S. involvement significantly. By 1963, over 16,000 military advisors were in Vietnam. Though he resisted sending combat troops, his administration escalated Americans' commitment to the South Vietnamese government. President Lyndon B. Johnson, from 1963 to 1969, Johnson took the war to a new level. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, he secured congressional approval to use military force. By 1968, over 500,000 U.S. troops were deployed. The war became deeply unpopular, sparking protests across the country as well as around the world. President Richard Nixon, from 1969 to 1974, Nixon introduced Vietnamization, a plan to withdraw U.S. troops and shift the fighting to South Vietnamese forces. He also expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos, sparking further controversy. In 1973, the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords, ending direct involvement, but the war didn't truly end until 1975, when Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces. Four presidents, 2 decades, one war that reshaped American politics, foreign policy, and public trust. The Vietnam War was a defining chapter in our U.S. history, and its lessons are still echoing within us today. When Eisenhower took office in 1953, the Cold War was just heating up. The U.S. was determined to contain communism, and the Southeast Asia became a key battleground. In 1955, when President Eisenhower committed U.S. support to the newly formed South Vietnam, he was sending military advisors and aid to bolster its government against Communist North. While Eisenhower didn't authorize the use of chemical weapons in Vietnam, it was his administration that played a crucial role in developing the tools that would later be used. During the 1950s, the U.S. Army's Chemical Corps, which was originally formed during World War I, continued to test herbicides like 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. These were the two main ingredients in what would become Agent Orange. These herbicides were initially researched for agricultural use, but military scientists at Fort Detrick in Maryland explored their potential for jungle warfare. The idea was to strip away dense vegetation that could conceal enemy forces, a tactic that would later define Operation Ranch Hand in the 1960s. Eisenhower's administration also supported the expansion of chemical research and infrastructure, laying the foundation for future deployment. Though he never ordered herbicide use in Vietnam, it was his policies and military investments that made it possible for later presidents to escalate the conflict with chemical agents. So, while Eisenhower's fingerprints aren't on the spray nozzles of Operation Ranch Hand, it was his decisions that helped load the barrels. The path to chemical warfare in Vietnam did not start with a single order. It was paved by years of Cold War strategy and aggressive scientific ambition. Just to share a bit of social context with you so you have some understanding of how things were progressing in the United States during that time. The late 1950s and early 1960s were a time of both stability and simmering change. Under Eisenhower, who served from 1953 to 1961, the United States enjoyed economic prosperity and a sense of post-war calm. His leadership style was cautious and measured, reflecting a desire to maintain order during the early Cold War years. Socially, however, the country was beginning to stir. Eisenhower warned against the rise of military industrial complex and oversaw the desegregation of schools following the Brown versus Board of Education. His administration was often criticized for its slow response to the growing civil rights movement. In 1957, crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas forced Eisenhower to send federal troops to enforce school integration, but only after significant pressure. Then came 1960. John F. Kennedy's election marked a generational shift. At just 43 years old, he brought a new energy and excitement to the presidency. His campaign promised a, quote, new frontier, a vision of social progress, scientific advancement, and global leadership. Kennedy's administration embraced a more active federal role in addressing poverty, civil rights, as well as education. Kennedy's social agenda included the creation of the Peace Corps, increased minimum wage, and expanded Social Security benefits. He began laying the groundwork for the civil rights legislation through much of it would be passed after, of course, his unfortunate assassination. When President Kennedy entered office in 1961, the Cold War was in full swing. Vietnam was seen as a critical front in the fight against communism. The U.S. was backing South Vietnam against the Communist North, and the dense jungle terrain gave enemy forces a major advantage. Kennedy's administration expanded that support, not just with military advisors, but with new tactics and technologies aimed at counterinsurgency. One of those tools was napalm, a jellied gasoline that sticks to surfaces and burns at temperatures over 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Originally developed during World War II, napalm was repurposed in Vietnam to destroy jungle cover and enemy hideouts. It was also used in airstrikes and flamethrowers to flush out Viet Cong fighters from tunnels and villages. Under Kennedy, the U.S. authorized the use of napalm in limited operations, though not as widespread as it would become under later presidents. However, this marked a turning point. In August of 1961, South Vietnamese President Ngo Diem requested U.S. help to eliminate jungle cover used by the Viet Cong. After internal debate, Kennedy approved a limited herbicide program. This marked the beginning of Operation Ranch Hand, a campaign that would eventually spray over 19 million gallons of herbicides across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Kennedy personally approved each mission at first, reflecting the sensitivity of using chemicals in warfare. But by November 1962, he delegated that authority to the U.S. Ambassador and Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, effectively expanding the program. The most infamous of these herbicides was Agent Orange, which of course was a toxic blend that was contaminated by dioxin. Though the long-term health effects weren't fully understood at the time, there were internal memos suggesting some officials were aware of the risks. Kennedy's decision to greenlight Operation Ranch Hand was driven by Cold War urgency, but it opened the door to one of the most controversial chapters of U.S. military history. The jungles were stripped bare, but the human and ecological toll would echo for generations. When President Johnson assumed the presidency in 1963, following the assassination of John F. Kennedy, he inherited a conflict in Vietnam and a covert herbicide program known as Operation Ranch Hand. Initially approved by Kennedy, this operation aimed to defoliate jungles and destroy crops used by the Viet Cong. But under Johnson, the scale of this program exploded. Between 1965 and 1969, during the height of U.S. involvement, over 15 million gallons of herbicides were sprayed, 75% of the total used during the war. The most infamous of these was Agent Orange. Johnson's administration viewed the herbicidal warfare as a tactical necessity. The dense jungles of Vietnam provided cover for guerrilla fighters, and destroying that cover was seen as a way to gain the upper hand. But the consequences were far reaching. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and U.S. veterans were exposed to those toxic chemicals. Despite growing concerns from scientists and activists, Johnson never publicly acknowledged the long term risk. His focus remained on military victory and containment of communism, a Cold War mindset that prioritized short term strategy over environmental and human costs. Lyndon B. Johnson did not start chemical warfare in Vietnam, but he dramatically escalated it. It was his decision that turned a limited defoliation effort into a full scale environmental assault, leaving a legacy that still haunts the land and its people. When President Nixon took office in 1969, the U.S. was deeply entrenched in Vietnam, and so was its use of chemical agents. Programs like Operation Ranch Hand had already sprayed millions of gallons of herbicides, including Agent Orange, across Southeast Asia. These chemicals were used to strip jungle cover and destroy crops, but also exposed civilians and soldiers to dioxin, a highly toxic compound. Facing mounting scientific evidence and public backlash, President Nixon took a pivotal step. In November 1969, he issued a sweeping statement renouncing the first use of lethal chemical and biological weapons and extended that renunciation to incapacitating chemicals as well. He also submitted the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which banned the first use of chemical and biological weapons for Senate ratification. Then in 1970, after studies linked 2,4,5-T, a key ingredient in Agent Orange, to birth defects, President Nixon ordered a partial ban on its use. The Department of Defense soon halted all Agent Orange missions in Vietnam. While chemical agents like CS tear gas and napalm continued to be used, Nixon's actions marked a turning point in U.S. chemical warfare policy. But Nixon's concerns with chemical safety didn't just stop at the battlefield. At home, he was also responding to a growing crisis. Thousands of American workers were being injured or killed each year due to unsafe working conditions, many involving toxic substances. In 1970, December specifically, Nixon signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which created OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Its mission was to ensure safe and healthful working conditions by setting and enforcing standards and by providing training, outreach, and education. So here's the paradox, or the wild thought. Richard Nixon, the president who presided over the final years of chemical warfare in Vietnam, also became the architect of America's most important workplace safety agency. His legacy is a reminder that leadership can be both reactive and reformative, shaped by pressure, science, and the shifting values of a nation. When Gerald Ford became president in 1974, August specifically, the Vietnam War was nearing its end, but its toxic legacy was far from over. The U.S. had officially ceased herbicide spraying in 1971, and the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, but Ford oversaw the final withdrawal of the American personnel and the fall of Saigon in April 1975. Though Ford did not initiate or expand chemical warfare, he was responsible for managing its consequences. His administration coordinated Operation Baby Lift and Operation New Life, evacuating over 100,000 Vietnamese refugees, many of whom had been exposed to herbicides like Agent Orange. Ford also supported humanitarian aid for those affected, signaling a shift from wartime tactics to post war responsibility. Meanwhile, on the home front, Ford inherited the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, also known as OSHA, which had been created under President Nixon in 1970. While Ford didn't create OSHA, he played a key role in preserving and stabilizing the agency during a time of political and business pushback. Ford's administration worked to balance worker protections with economic concerns as industries pushed back against what they saw as a burdensome set of regulations. Rather than dismantle OSHA, Ford supported its mission and allowed it to continue, developing safety standards, inspections, and enforcement mechanisms. His approach helped OSHA survive its early growing pains and became a permanent fixture in American labor policy. So while Gerald Ford didn't drop the chemicals or draft the OSHA charter, he stood at the crossroads, managing the fallout of one and the future of the other. His presidency marked a quiet but crucial moment in the evolution of American responsibility, both abroad and home. By the time President Carter took office in 1977, the Vietnam War had officially ended, but its toxic legacy was still unfolding. Millions of gallons of herbicides, especially Agent Orange, had been sprayed across Southeast Asia. Now we had veterans that were beginning to report serious health issues, and the U.S. government was under pressure to respond. Carter's administration didn't initiate chemical warfare, but it did acknowledge its human costs. His team began funding studies into long term effects of Agent Orange exposure and opened the door to future compensation programs. Though full accountability would come later, Carter helped shift the conversation from denial to recognition. But Carter's commitment to chemical safety wasn't limited to the battlefield. On February 26, 1980, he signed Executive Order 12196. It was a sweeping directive that expanded the reach of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to cover federal employees, a group previously outside the agency's full jurisdiction. This executive order required every federal agency to identify and eliminate workplace hazards, conduct regular safety inspections, protect whistleblowers, and train employees and supervisors in occupational safety practices. It also empowered the Secretary of Labor to evaluate agency programs, conduct unannounced inspections, and report directly to the President on unsafe conditions. In short, it made OSHA accountable not just to private industry but to the federal government itself. However, this order did not cover active service or military personnel, those that are working in uniform. So, while Jimmy Carter didn't drop the chemicals in Vietnam, he helped the nation reckon with its aftermath and made sure that federal workers wouldn't face similar dangers in silence. Executive Order 12196 was a turning point in workplace safety and a reminder that leadership means protecting people, even when the cameras are off. Let's start with the people. Roughly 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam between 1960 and 1973. They were overwhelmingly young. The average was just 19. About 88% were white, 10% were black, and the rest were Hispanic, Asian, or Native American. Many were drafted, others volunteered, but all were swept into conflict that would define a generation. Roughly 10.6% of U.S. military personnel who served in Vietnam were black men, about 275,000 individuals. However, the story behind the number is more complex. While African Americans made up around 11% of the U.S. population at the time, they were overrepresented in combat roles. In fact, 23% of combat troops in Vietnam were black. Early in the war, they were also disproportionately drafted. 16.3% of all draftees in 1967 were African American. The imbalance led to high casualty rates early on. 12.5% of all U.S. deaths in Vietnam were black soldiers. These disparities sparked protests and demands for reforms, both within the military and back home. Now, just to shift for a moment, let's look at a particular veteran. Among veterans was Paul Rudershon. He was not African American. He was a white veteran. He was a U.S. Army helicopter crew chief. He was a health conscious, disciplined young man who believed in his mission. But in 1978, years after returning home, Paul was diagnosed with aggressive abdominal cancer. He believed it to be caused by flying through clouds of Agent Orange, the herbicide sprayed to defoliate jungles and destroy enemy crops. Before his death, the same year, Paul went on national television and said, "I died in Vietnam, but I didn't know it." He founded Agent Orange Victims International, and his story became a rallying cry for thousands of veterans who were falling ill. Paul Rudishan's voice may have been silenced by cancer, but his legacy lives on in every veteran who stood up and said, "We deserve answers." Agent Orange was just one of several rainbow herbicides used during the war. The long-term impact of these chemicals: veterans exposed to Agent Orange have suffered from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, lung cancer, Parkinson's disease, kidney disease, and other tumors and cancers. The children have reported birth defects like spina bifida, congenital heart disease, as well as random autoimmune illnesses. In Vietnam, entire regions remain contaminated, and health effects have spanned 3 generations. The story of Agent Orange isn't just about war. It's about accountability, science, and the fight for justice that continues to this day. So what does this mean for Generation Xers and Millennials? It means the war doesn't always end when the guns go silent. It means that the children of soldiers and the civilians alike are still living with the consequences of decisions made over decades. And it means the fight for recognition, research, and justice is far from over. Ironically, it was America that created the largest, most widespread chemical workplace disaster to date, with the most severe, far reaching consequences through chemical exposure that had the potential to permanently alter DNA of many veterans before they could have children or during their window of their highest fertility. As a safety professional, as well as a direct descendant of a Vietnam veteran personally impacted by the long term impacts of Agent Orange, I am left pondering a few thoughts that I would like to share with you. How many of us or our loved ones will suffer from random or elusive diseases associated with Agent Orange, but the government refuses to acknowledge in a timely manner? 2, what is a human life really worth? Testing showed issues with these chemicals long before they were used, but our government proceeded anyway. Will we find ourselves going down a similar road again in the future? Number 3, it is ironic OSHA's initial regulations were related to hazardous materials and chemicals. And 4, are we properly vetting chemicals used in the workplace today prior to process implementation? Are we taking an aggressive approach in whatever role we have? Or is it more of a good enough for government type of approach? These are just a few thoughts that this story, as I researched it, made me kind of wonder and ponder and want to share with you out loud. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to meeting with you all again to share another safety story.